In ancient Rome, the act of escape was not merely a defiance of one's enslaver. It was a public insult to the entire Roman order. For enslaved women who dared to flee, one of the first and most enduring punishments was to be branded with a hot iron, forever marked as a fugitive or runaway. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a deliberate, painful, and disfiguring act designed to shame, control, and permanently identify. The branding was usually burned into the forehead, making concealment impossible. These marks commonly bore the letters FVG, short for fugitives, or even a full inscription such as Teniote fugitive, meaning I hold you, fugitive. When Roman slave owners caught women who had run away, they made sure everyone would know what these women had done. The punishment was meant to hurt badly and last forever. The owners would heat up pieces of iron until they were red hot. Then they would press these burning pieces of metal onto the woman's forehead. The pain was terrible, and the mark would never go away. The letters they burned into the skin were like a permanent tattoo that could never be removed. Sometimes they just burned the letters FVG, which was short for the Latin word meaning runaway. Other times they burned whole words that said things like, I hold you, fugitive. This meant that the woman belonged to someone and could never escape that fact. These branded women became walking advertisements of what happened to slaves who tried to run away. Other enslaved people, especially women, would see these marks and think twice about trying to escape themselves. The Romans knew that fear was a powerful tool to keep people under control. Once a woman was branded, she could never hide what she had done. Even if she somehow got free later, or if someone tried to help her blend in with regular Roman citizens, the mark on her forehead would always give her away. The burn scar was like a permanent name tag that said, runaway slave for the rest of her life. The branding usually happened in public places where lots of people could watch. The slave owners wanted everyone to see what happened to women who tried to escape. They would often beat the woman or say mean things to her while they burned the mark into her skin. The physical pain was bad enough, but the shame and embarrassment often hurt even more. For women, this punishment was especially cruel because Roman society cared a lot about how women looked. A woman's face was supposed to be beautiful and unmarked. When a woman had a big ugly burn scar on her forehead, she was seen as damaged goods. She lost any chance of being treated with respect or dignity, even by other slaves. Sometimes the women would fight back when they were about to be branded. When this happened, several people would hold the woman down while someone else pressed the hot iron into her skin. The woman might scream or cry, but no one would help her. This scene happened so often that it became normal and routine. Roman law did not care if the slave was a man or woman when it came to punishment. Both got treated badly. But women had extra problems because they were seen as weaker and were often abused in other ways too. The branding was just one of many terrible things that could happen to enslaved women who tried to get their freedom. Another common punishment was to chain escaped women at the front gate of their owner's house. This was called being chained. At Januam in Latin, the main entrance of a Roman house was very important. It was where visitors came and where the family showed their status to the world. When a woman was chained there, she became part of the house's decoration, but not in a good way. The woman would be attached to the gate or a column near the door with heavy iron chains. She had to stay there for days or even weeks, depending on how angry her owner was. Everyone who walked by could see her there. Friends, neighbors, other slaves, and strangers would all know that this woman had tried to run away and got caught. Being chained at the gate was especially embarrassing for women because Roman culture said women should stay inside and be modest. Having to sit outside where everyone could stare at her was considered a terrible shame. Sometimes the women were not given enough clothes, which made the punishment even more humiliating. The weather made things worse. If it was hot, the woman would suffer from the sun beating down on her all day. If it rained, she would get soaked and cold. If it was winter, she might freeze. The chains were heavy and hurt her wrists and ankles. She often was not given enough food or water, which made her weak and sick. The whole point was to make other slaves scared. When they saw a woman chained at the gate, they would think about what would happen if they tried to escape too. The message was clear. If you try to run away, you will be caught and punished in a way that everyone can see. Some Roman writers, like Plautus, wrote plays that mentioned slaves being chained at gates. Even though these were meant to be funny, they show that this punishment really happened. Archaeologists have found iron chains in the ruins of Roman houses, which proves that chaining slaves was a real practice. This punishment was designed to break the woman's spirit. Being treated like an object instead of a person, being stared at by everyone, and being unable to hide or escape, the shame was meant to destroy her will to ever try running away again. The worst punishment of all was being sent to fight wild animals in the arena. Most people think of gladiators when they hear about Roman arenas, but the truth is much darker. The Romans also used these big stadiums to kill people as entertainment. Escaped slave women could be sentenced to die in these public shows. This punishment was called damnatio ad bestias, which means being condemned to the beasts. It was used for serious crimes like rebellion, stealing, or running away multiple times. Since slaves had no legal rights, running away was seen as a crime against the state and their owner. The executions were not meant to be quick or merciful. They were designed to entertain the crowd. The women would be brought into the arena with no weapons or armor to protect them. Wild animals like lions, bears, or leopards would be released to attack them. Sometimes the women were chained to posts, so they could not even try to run away from the animals. Other times, the women would be forced to fight each other with small weapons that were not very useful. The crowd would cheer and laugh as the women struggled to survive. Unlike real gladiators who were trained fighters, these women had no skills and no chance of winning. Their deaths were guaranteed from the start. The Romans sometimes made the executions even more cruel by creating themed shows. They might dress the women up like characters from myths and legends and kill them in ways that matched the stories. Some women were burned alive while the crowd watched. Others were killed in elaborate ways that were meant to be like theater performances. For enslaved women, this punishment was extra humiliating because they were put on display in front of thousands of people. The Roman audience enjoyed watching. People they considered to be less than human suffer and die. Female prisoners were sometimes made to play specific roles in these death shows, which made their suffering into entertainment. Roman historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio wrote about women in the arena, though they usually focused on wealthy women or female gladiators rather than enslaved women. However, legal documents and stone inscriptions prove that enslaved women were definitely killed in these shows. The crowd saw these executions as justice being served. The message was that enslaved people's bodies belonged to their owners and to the Roman state. If someone tried to rebel by running away, they could expect not just death, but the most shameful and public death possible. These women were turned into warnings for other slaves, silenced forever by blood and the cheers of the crowd. Whipping was probably the most common punishment for escaped enslaved women. The whip was not just a tool to cause pain, it was a symbol that showed who had power and who did not. Roman law gave slave owners complete control over their slaves' bodies. Running away was considered a serious crime, and whipping was the preferred way to punish it. The Romans used a special whip called a flagrum, which had multiple leather strips that sometimes had pieces of metal or bone attached to them. This made the whip much more dangerous and painful than a regular whip. The punishment could happen in private inside the house, or in public, where other people could watch and learn from the example. There was no limit to how many times a woman could be whipped. No court or government official had to approve the punishment. Roman law said that slave owners could punish runaways as harshly as they wanted. In practice, this meant unlimited cruelty, especially if the escape had embarrassed the owner or cost them money. For women, the punishment often included deliberate acts to destroy their dignity and sense of self. After being whipped, the woman might be left bleeding and collapsed, with her clothes torn, deliberately displayed in front of other slaves so they could see what happened to people who tried to escape. The whipping was not just about causing pain. It was about making the woman into a visible reminder to others about what would happen if they disobeyed. The screams, the blood, and the sight of the woman's torn back were all part of the lesson that the owner wanted to teach. This punishment was not only accepted, it was expected. A woman who had tried to escape was seen not just as a criminal, but as someone who had disrupted the order of the household. Her punishment had to show that the owner was still completely in control. Roman writers like Horace, Juvenal, and Petronius mentioned whipping in their works as if it was perfectly normal. This shows that brutal physical punishment was neither rare nor questioned in Roman society. While their writings might have been exaggerated for effect, they reflected a world where cruelty was built into the system of slavery. Sometimes whipping was just the beginning. After being whipped, a woman might also be branded, chained, or sent to do harder work. The whip was the tool that slave owners used most often to show their power instantly and without restraint. The most feared punishment was being sent to work in the mines. For enslaved women who tried to escape, this penalty was not just punishment. It was basically a slow death sentence carried out through forced labor under deadly conditions. While men were sent to mines more often, enslaved women were not exempt, especially if they had tried to escape multiple times. The official name for this punishment was damnatio in metallum, which means condemnation to the mines. It was legally allowed and considered one of the most extreme forms of punishment. It was usually reserved for people who had committed serious crimes, including desertion, theft, or in the case of slaves, repeated attempts to escape. Mines in Roman territories, like Noricum, Dacia, and Sardinia, were known for being deadly places to work. The air was full of dust that made it hard to breathe. There was almost no fresh air, and the tunnels could collapse at any time. Enslaved. Workers had to do backbreaking work with simple tools, and they were exposed to poisonous substances like mercury and lead. For women, the experience was especially horrible. They had to do the same hard work as men, carrying heavy stones, crushing ore, and clearing debris, but they faced additional dangers. Guards and overseers often abused them, and there was no one to protect them or help them. Most importantly, there was no way to escape or return home. Being sent to the mines was almost always a life sentence. Very few people survived long enough to be released. Death from exhaustion, starvation, or injuries was common. There are records of enslaved people being chained together, kept underground, for days at a time, and beaten if they worked too slowly. Enslaved women who were pregnant were not spared from this punishment. Some gave birth in the mines, only to watch their babies die shortly after from exposure or neglect. The conditions were so bad that survival was almost impossible for adults, much less for newborn children. Unlike other punishments like whipping or branding that happened in public, being sent to the mines was deliberately hidden from view. It was punishment through erasure. A woman sent to the mines was not meant to be seen again. Her suffering happened in darkness, far away from the city, where no one would witness it. But it was no less real. If anything, it was more complete and total. The punishments that Rome used against enslaved women who tried to escape: branding, public chaining, fighting wild animals, whipping, and mining, showed an empire that was willing to destroy human dignity to protect its social order. These acts maintained power by spreading fear and terror, reminding everyone that domination depends on visible pain and suffering. These historical practices are not just ancient history. Their echoes can still be heard today wherever force and coercion are used to silence freedom and control people. As the Roman philosopher Seneca once warned, servisunt immo homines. They are slaves? No, they are human beings. This reminder that enslaved people were human beings who deserved dignity and respect was radical then, and remains important now.